Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Do 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 da 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 dum. Well, hello everybody. Denise Matto here again. Yeah, I just watched or listened to an interesting conversation between Mark D. Parker and a man I haven't really encountered. I've seen his name bandied about, but I haven't seen any channels or anything with him, named Rod Hare, who's apparently, as I say, his name's been bandied about. He's a participant in the TLC. It was a very interesting conversation, enlightening in many ways. And again, the more I try to back away and say, really should be nicer and, maybe soft pedal a little bit. Maybe I'm putting my own emotions into this a little too much. And once again, the very one that I'm thinking maybe I'm being too rough on the guy comes out and confirms even worse and worse. I'll put the link to this particular thing uh, below because Rod Hare is a very interesting person. Has that. Uh, he has the kind of personality that the Estuary and TLC try to publicly present as what they're doing, a general Christian sort of influenced outlook on life, a willingness to really think about the problems we face in our civilization today in a non-adversarial way. And it kind of hooks into my original thing when I was a friendly guest on Paul Vanderklay's stream, talking about my actual personal struggle with trying to live without using the label, because the labels are becoming such problems, either because they've become perverted by other people misusing them. I think the Christian label for many years has had that problem. And so you can't say you're Christian without saying, well, I'm Christian, but I'm not this or I am that or whatever. It's complicated, right? And then the idea of just living label free in an identity obsessed society is a challenge in and of itself. So Rod Hare presents the personality of someone who seems to be successfully living that life. And he got into a conversation with Mark D. Parker about what is Mark D. Parker actually trying to accomplish here in a much gentler way than me, much less adversarial, much less confrontational. And he elicited Mark D. Parker revealing himself to believe that he's in the role of a prophet, to believe that the TLC and the estuary need to be brought in line with his actually Branhamite beliefs. He doesn't refer to William Branham, and I bring the name up because there are several very good channels. There's William Branham History, that's the YouTube channel, and then there's Leaving the Message by the same people. It's another channel, and they're both about the history and theology of the American charismatic Pentecostal movements that came up in the, I think they started at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. There was a big revival in the early 1900s in California. Then there was the tent meeting revival movement throughout the South. Then television came into play in the 50s, and all the televangelists and the nutcases like Kenneth Copeland and these others started up. But there's a strong history that entwines with American culture, which is very important because it falls on both sides of the line. A lot of the MAGA coalition people are full Branhamite. Mark D. Parker is a left wing Branhamite, um, pursuing this sense that he is a prophet. And he's showing his full delusion. He's had visions that are telling him that he has to do this, he has to, pull TLC into this. He talks about this openly, and I've seen him refer to it. I'm not at all surprised at anything he is saying to Rod Hare. It's just a little bit surprised that he's being so articulate about it. That's why I'm putting the link down there so that you can actually listen. And Paul Vanderklay certainly has the responsibility to know enough about religious delusion. It's one thing to believe that there may be prophecy and revelation and talk about things like that. I've talked at times about something that I've experienced called a coup d'esprit, which is just a sense of awareness that something might mean something. And then sometimes it's years later when I remember it and like, oh, I'm back in the same, it's usually location specific. I'll be somewhere and something will just hit me that I should remember this location. Sometimes it's something as mild as a street sign. And then years later, I go somewhere or I go back to that location or I'm somewhere else with the same name as was on that street sign. And all of a sudden I feel like, oh, that relates to this. And I see synchronicities, but I recognize what they're synchronicities, coincidental elements in your life. Coincidence of noticing a street sign and for some reason feeling like I should remember that name, and then later making some significant life choices, which ended up being in a place in a totally different region, but happens to have the same name as that street sign in a distant city. So you see, there's nothing irrational about that. But if I were to take the step and say, oh, this means I am compelled and destined to be a prophet and all this other, well, then like, well, you've got some probably textbook level clinical symptoms going on there. And Mark D. Parker describes himself in that delusional way. He refers to the prophet Nathan several times as being the role he believes he's fulfilling in relation to the TLC people. And as I say, Paul Vanderklay has no excuse to claim he doesn't see what he's doing when he promotes that kind of person into leadership. If Paul Vanderklay were not pushing this delusional left-wing political violent activist, and he does, and Mark D. Parker does go into his beliefs about politics, very thinly veiled. He tries to pretend he's not in favor of left-wing violence, but he's doing all the things that the Antifa mobs are doing. And some people might disagree with me, maybe because they're not really clear what I'm talking about. Or they might disagree with me because they kind of in favor of that sort of thing. But there's no excuse for Paul Vanderklay. If Paul Vanderklay were not promoting Parker as an important person and accepting him as a very public, very aggressive fundraiser, identifying himself. Parker identifies himself with the Livingstone's Church, which is not a Branhamite church. Mark Parker does not go to that church. He has said that if he goes back to church, which he's a prophet unto himself now, if he were to return to church, it would be to one of these charismatic holiness prophet churches, a Branhamite church. Um, as I say, you'll never hear Brant Parker use the word Branhamite because that's a human being who was very instrumental in establishing that movement in the early 1900s and mid 1900s, maybe the 1960s, who had people believing that he himself, William Branham, was a manifestation of God. Okay, that's the kind of delusion that Mark D. Parker is describing himself as believing is who he is. He isn't saying he's God. He's only saying he's a prophet on the level of the prophet Nathan in the Bible. Okay. Say that much for him. He hasn't claimed to be God yet, but he does claim to have the right to require other people in the TLC, this little corner group, and the estuary group, to drop their own ideas and beliefs about what is their life as Christians, what are their priorities supposed to be, and fulfill Parker's left-wing political mission. Um, and I hold Paul Vanderklay responsible because if he were not promoting Parker into this fundraising position, which gives him authority, Parker would just be an odd person in the group. And he could be listened to or dismissed as people choose. Now, as far as the fundraising is concerned, Parker drops a very interesting little remark. It's just a slight remark, but it says a lot. In answering one of Rod Hare's questions about why about how he got involved with TLC, he apparently had this vision before he decided to step into TLC. And he was watching Paul Vanderklay. This is in the conversation. I think it might be about a third of the way in. And he was feeling this vision urge to do something. And he gave Vanderklay some kind of donation. And he cites that as this he saw as his way to get involved. And he talks a little bit about, not having seen a real clear donation button or something and how he did it. And he kind of makes a little joke that, after all, he did buy Vanderklay a burrito. And yeah, you can laugh at it and say, well, it was just a little joke. But it displays that he sees himself using the money that he's raising for the Living Stones Church. And he's very clear in all of his speech about his fundraising efforts that it's for that bricks and mortar church. He's claiming ownership there. Vanderklay should be able to see that and should not allow it. Because you can't be the pastor of a group that has a set of beliefs and sell that congregation to an outsider who doesn't even share their belief system. I mean, you say, oh no, he does. They're both Christian. It's like, well, very, very different types. And as I say, Rod Hare is kind of like a general, more secular kind of person who is able to have respectful conversations and is a lot less confrontational than I am. And so the conversation continues in very interesting ways. It shows exactly what I've been saying. And I wish that I could find a channel or whatever. I couldn't find anything that's related to Rod Hare. He probably has some kind of other name on his YouTube or whatever, or his Twitter. Um, because he raised the questions, the same questions I've been raising, but in a much more polite way. And I did go on to Parker's stream the other day and kind of trolled him a little bit by saying, "Hey, no justice, no peace. No justice for American Christian children." You know, my daughter changed her name from Sojourner Jackson to Faith Jackson 10 years before she was killed. And the reason she did that, because I was trying to get her to leave Massachusetts. And it's interesting that Rod Hare and a lot of these people clustering around this have some experience up there in New England. It's interesting just to see how much of the energy that's going into the core group of this cult has its roots in Massachusetts and Connecticut. But anyway, that's not, it's just one of those things that's coincidental. And I can't help but notice it. Um, my daughter, I had moved down to Texas, as I've said in another video when I speak more about my own life path, um, because of encountering some of the cult behavior that several of my relatives who were really quite criminal. I mean, they made a lot of money in the corporate world and it was corrupt money. There's a branch of my family that can buy and sell a judge in Massachusetts at the drop of a hat, and they've done it. And if you think I'm exaggerating, look up Lennox 7, Lenox, number 7, comma, NYC, no, NYT for New York Times, okay, comma, Burke, Burke. You put that in search, you're going to come up with some news stories from early 1980s, most of them 1981 and 82. You're going to go deep into the archives in the search. You're going to see them come up. And it's all about the double homicide of a GE union steward's son and his friend, committed by 7 boys who were all related to GE management. One of them was the nephew of a capo, or he was, his last name is the same as a capo in the Patriarca crime family, and he was the nephew of the corrupt district attorney in Berkshire County where this happened in 1981. 2 young men thrown into a car that had no handles on the inside, and it was pushed into a lake and they were drowned. My nephew is the one with the last name Burke. That's my sister's son. He was pulled into the whole thing by being approached by the ringleader, the one that's related to the Patriarca crime family. His last name was Bianco. And he asked my nephew to drive them to this boat ramp where they were going to settle a score. My nephew thought they were going to have a fist fight. Not uncommon between 19, 20-year-old young men in the 1980s. And it's not uncommon even today. That's all he thought it was going to be, was a fist fight. They were driving away, and when he did what he was told, stayed up on the road, kept the engine running, couldn't see what was going on the shoreline of the lake at the boat ramp. But then he heard noise and he saw his friends running to the truck, being chased by the other kids who were at the boat ramp. They jump in the truck, drive, drive, drive. He's speeding away, and they're saying, "We killed him. We killed them both." And that's how he became part of that crime. And my sister, as I say, we could buy and sell judges at the drop of a hat. I'm not from a poor family. I'm from a working class family that made good. You were able to back in the day. If you grew up in the 60s and 70s, you grew up among people who could definitely do very well, from working class to middle class and higher. And my family did. Anyway, I digress. The point is, when my sister got involved with that level of corruption, she also got involved with very serious religious political cult. And it was to escape that, because I saw what was going on. I didn't fully grasp everything she was doing. I didn't grasp just how deep the corruption went politically with the Democrats. I was a Democrat myself, but I knew it was not safe to stay in Massachusetts. I knew what my sister was up to. I knew what my nephew had been part of. And when I tried to get my daughter to move away from Massachusetts, to join me in Texas, she had already lived in Texas for a while. She didn't like it. It's much harder for a young woman to have a free and easy life in Texas than it is for a woman my age. So it was around 2005. She had already changed her name among all her friends. I was still calling her by the family nickname of Soji, which was short for Sojourner. And then she said, please call her Faith, because she was telling me, no, I'm not willing to move to Texas. I don't like Texas. My friends are all here. And she said, I'll be fine as long as I don't talk to the rest of your family. And she referred to it as my family, not hers, because I had raised her apart from them. She had been attacked several times. My mistake was inviting her to come to her grandmother's wake when my mother died, because she did know her grandparents from her earlier childhood, but all through her teenage years and young adult years. And she was 34 when she died, so she was in her late 20s when my mother died. She had been raised separate from them. So it was a bit of a reunion. My father was still alive and was very happy to be reunited with his granddaughter. But unfortunately, she got on my sister's radar. And we were having the conversation. I was still interested in getting her to move down to Texas. And she was telling me why she wouldn't. But then she said something very, very important. She said she had changed her name to Faith. All her friends have been calling her Faith for years up there. Would I please acknowledge it and start calling her Faith? That she felt that by doing that, she was doing two things. One, she thought she was putting a wall between herself and the family. I felt that they wouldn't respect that, and I was right. But that's what she was doing. But also, and most important, she had a very firm, fully baptized relationship with Jesus. Many would object because she lived a very loose philosophical life. Most of her friends were into stuff like Wicca, and she was into it alongside them. But at the same time, she did have a strong Bible background. She did have full knowledge of Jesus Christ. And these idiots in the TLC and the estuary, these Protestants that want to judge, you don't know. You're all committing sins yourself. You're all believing all kinds of weird stuff that is not in the Bible. You're all doing stuff the Bible tells you you're not supposed to be doing. So judge not. I know that at a certain level, when she was pushed to denounce Christ, she refused repeatedly. I had seen her get beat up in school when she was younger because that's what they were doing in Massachusetts. That's why I was trying to reason with her that Massachusetts, by the late 90s, Massachusetts was lost. It had been completely turned into a complete totalitarian cult. The corruption of the politics that enabled the Lennox Seven to actually get away. They did get away with that double homicide. They were wrongfully acquitted of it. Um, and it was due to the fact that this cult had taken over. And the murder of that Union steward's son was a mob hit on his family. And the cult in Massachusetts is entangled like this with the New England Mafia. Anyway, she believed that what she was doing was forcing her friends to acknowledge that she was a person of faith. I don't care how misguided you think she was. You know how misguided I think you are if you're in the TLC. Even if I think you're one of the, and most of these guys are innocent of Paul Vanderklay's cult manipulations. They're being manipulated in some cases, and they're just ignoring it in other cases. But we all have sinned and fallen short. That's a biblical saying. So, in many ways, my daughter sinned, as have I, as have you, whoever you are listening. But she made that statement that she was going to stay there knowing that she was facing continuous demands to denounce Christ or be punished. And she suffered. She lost jobs. She was pushed around. She maintained her Wicca friendships and her Wicca practices, going to festivals or whatever. But in spite of all of it, she did not commit the unforgivable sin. She did not deny the Holy Spirit. She did not deny Christ. And I believe that was part of why she was killed. Because she refused to take that step. That's why she changed her name. So for the last 10 years of her life, she was using her name Faith as a witnessing tool in a situation where you could no longer witness as a Christian. The cults in Massachusetts, I say cults plural because they cooperate with each other. The mafia is a cult of its own. You've got the media cult, you've got the Antifa political Bolshevik stuff. They all intertangle. You've got the Discordian cult. That's where it comes into YouTube. That's where Grim Grizz comes out of. That's what Paul Vanderklay is part of. He has a Discord server, and these people are being exploited for every bit of metadata that they don't even realize they're providing when they're in the Discord. And the Discord platform was started by people from the Anonymous Collective, which is another cult. Again, totally entangled with the politics Mark D. Parker calls himself still a charismaniac. He comes out of that cult, the Pentecostal charisma, name yourself a prophet stuff. And Vanderklay did not stop Parker from calling him bishop. And several other members of this cult that is forming inside the TLC joined Parker in calling Paul Vanderklay Bishop Vanderklay, which is a big part of this delusional prophet cult that Parker is openly telling Rod Hare he's promoting. Now, Rod Hare, as I say, he's not that Christian. He says, he did learn a lot from the Bible as a kid, so that's part of his formation, but his general approach to life is more secular that's the impression I got. And he expressed admiration for history that Parker is giving him of Parker's cult. And he mentions, he compares it to history he gets from another TLC member about the church fathers, which I think refers to early Catholic church history. So the impression I got was that maybe Rod Hare isn't really, I hope if Rod Hare comes across this video and listens to me, I hope he looks up William Branham history, Branham, and you'll find well-documented full history that is probably going to open your eyes to the lies Parker tells. Because it's more of a political than a religious group. And, I wish I could step away from this, but like I say, I turn around and there's more. Oh well. Denise Matto, over and out.